Welcome to everyone, and welcome to this very special session. Actually, we're in a series we've been having from the Dogears Bookshop and from Goa, and as you know, I'm part of the Goa Arts and Literature Festival. It's been going well. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Leonard, for hosting. Today is a particular pleasure, I must say. It's really a privilege. I've been reading the book, and I'll talk to you about it for a minute. But we have with us one of the great intellectual voices of our times. She is a fellow of the British Academy and holds honorary doctorates on universities of Calcutta, Oxford, and Chicago, amongst others. She is an honorary fellow of Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and SOAS, London. In 2008, she was awarded the prestigious Klug Prize of the Library of Congress, USA. A note on that, actually, the Klug Prize, for those who do not know it, was set up by, there was a gentleman named Klug, who used to own Metro Media, and he set up a prize which covers areas that the Nobel Prize does not, and it focuses on the study of humanity, really. And Professor Thapar won. It is for people whose career displays deep intellectual accomplishment. It carries a wonderful cash prize as well, and Professor Thapar, did India and all of us proud by winning it. So that's something to note. I might add there is a wonderful citation for Professor Thapar from the Klug Prize. I might add it in the chat window. At this point, I'd like to say I have a number of questions for Professor Thapar. And before I welcome her formally, please add your own questions into the chat window, which is open on the right. And as you add those questions, I will consider them. And perhaps after we take a few of our questions, Professor Thapar will choose to answer them. Two other things that I think are of note about Professor Thapar is she has twice, and it fits into the theme of the book, she has twice refused the Padma Bhushan Award, which for on the grounds that she would prefer to get honors, which she can explain herself, but she would prefer to get honors from her in her own disciplines, academic honors, rather than from the state, which I think is a really remarkable thing that she's done. And she was a student of the great Basham at SOAS. So those are some of the things that I think we should take a note of. 2 days from now is also Professor Thapar's birthday. So I would like to, in that vein, welcome Professor Thapar. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really a privilege. I couldn't tell you how pleased I am. I've been elated all day. But welcome to our session. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much indeed, Vivek. That's very kind of you to say what you said. I always try and keep my birthday a dark secret, but it's never been announced in a loud way like this before. Anyway.
Well, it's Goa, and normally I actually considered how we could possibly sing you happy birthday because we are Goans, and we cannot stop. I mean, at least some of us are Goans, so I cannot suppress ourselves. But your birthday is on Wikipedia, right? So it's a little bit, it's not so private anymore. But anyway, happy birthday in advance. Allow us to be the first to wish you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Thapar, it's a marvelous book. As I wrote to you, I think we have a lot to be grateful about because it's a magisterial work, like so many of yours are. It comes from ancient India, which is your specialty, but it's also in the way that you've constructed your argument. It's crystalline in its construction and coherence, and meticulous in making the case for dissent, dissent as a vehicle, dissent as an integral part of our culture, dissent in its importance in making the country that we know we live in today. And I love the two personal kind of bookends, the emotional resonance, the emotional core of your book, in your own meetings, which span this extraordinary sweep of our entire modern history or entire contemporary history, which is meeting Gandhiji in Pune, and then, of course, you visiting Shaheen Bagh either earlier this year or I guess earlier this year. So it's an amazing book. I wanted to ask you a few quick questions about it. Shall we go through the questions that I sent you earlier first? Right. Would that be best?
Yes, I think that would be something. Yes.
Okay. So you spend a sizable portion of your book describing the role of the other and otherness in your definition of dissent and how that has played out historically. Can we construe here that difference is enough to constitute dissent? And with an eye on today, why is it that you pursue that particular tack?
Okay, in a sense, what you're asking me is to explain why I decided to write on this subject. Um, Let me begin by saying that the acknowledgement of the other and of otherness is not in itself dissent, but it's one of the portals through which there can be the entry of dissent. Difference in itself is not invariably dissent. It can be just a matter of preference. I like wheat bread, you like rice. This is not dissent, this is difference of preference. Um, but it has the potential of dissent. When difference comes in, you never know at what point it might become dissent. And the point at which it becomes dissent, I think, is when you project an alternative to what is, and you say, question the existing situation, and you present an alternative which is picked up by people who find otherwise that they're quite happy with the world as it is, but there is an element of doubt that comes in, which is expressed through your dissent. Dissent is therefore a consciously thought out difference. It's not a casual difference. And it pertains to disagreement with what is either generally accepted or is an acceptance of the general pattern. Now, I've been interested in the concept of dissent for many, many years, decades really. And some of the examples that I choose and I've used in the book really come from my earlier writings, where I have discussed them in much greater detail. And my initial interest arose from the fact that in the history of every religion, there are issues of dissent that surface from time to time. However much one might try and paper them over, the fact is that they do exist. And some amongst these issues gather support and they lead to a mutation of the existing beliefs or a breakaway. And these kinds of events inevitably result in some reformulation of the religion. I also then examined social and cultural history, and I began to analyze the occurrences of historical change from the perspective of the degree to which change reflects dissent or its absence. And what we call a civilization, for instance, gets built up gradually through a process of the interface of ideas and activities. It's not a one-time, one-line linear development. It's always the interface of different ideas. And out of this mixing of ideas, there emerge the elements that go into the making of a civilization. So for me, civilizations are very, very complicated. They're not simple. And one has to separate, as it were, the different elements that go into it. A clear and major example of dissenting ideas, the earliest major example, I think, from the Indian tradition is one that I do briefly discuss in the book. That is the emergence of what we call the Shramana sects. These sects being that of the Buddhists, the Jains, the Ajivakas, and some people would add the Charvak, the materialist philosophers. They were all opposed to Vedic Brahmanism. And these were the sects that the Brahmins, in turn, dismissed by saying they're Nastika, they're non-believers. And so, despite all this, the point is that when we analyze Indian civilization, Buddhist thinking has contributed enormously to the making of civilization, despite the fact that Buddhism begins as a dissenting philosophy. And this is a very major example of how a dissenting philosophy contributes to the making of a civilization. And yes, to answer your question further, since the present in many ways emerges from the past, I was very bothered by the statement that is frequently made that dissent in our times in India is a concept borrowed from the West. It is therefore alien, they say, to Indian culture. And I want to show that there is enough from the past to state that there is nothing alien about dissent. It's very much a presence in Indian thinking, and the activities of dissent and confirmation both go together from the earliest times.
And super interesting from non-believer, if you like, to anti-national. I mean, there's a
Correct.
kind of a direct.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. Professor Thapar, the first parts of your essay, and it's I would say, somewhat whimsically referred to as an essay because it's more than an essay, obviously, but it's an essay. It's an essay maybe in the sense that you've essayed um, a, uh, a strong argument. But the first parts of your essay focus on dissent as it pertains to religion, and it spends. I mean, obviously, you've spent a lot of time studying it, but it's a strong choice that you've made. And my question to you is, why did you choose this idiom, the idiom of religion, and this what, as you describe as interface with society? And what does your investigation tell us about the way that we choose to look back from our 21st century vantage at this, the history which continues to be so contested, which you spend so much time writing about?
Okay, that's a big question. I should say that's a big bunch of
It
questions.
is. It is.
My time over them. Um, let's remember that dissent is registered in various forms. I agree, religion is not the only place where you find dissent. And since it has a presence to varying degrees in many activities, this presence is not always recognized. But religion is a fairly obvious idiom where its recognition becomes apparent quite clearly and quite quickly. One has beliefs and one performs acts of worship, or one does not follow those beliefs in a particular form. Where there is dissent, it may be muted, but it may also be expressed in clear terms. And it is our business as historians to try and suggest which is muted and which is quite obvious. We think of religion largely in terms of its theology and its teachings. The history of religion is always its theology. But by extension, we also introduce some of the law-like observances. You shall do this and you shall not do that. And these the practitioners have to conform to. But we seldom discuss, in any detail at least, the institutions that religions establish in a society and through which they attempt to control society. And this is where the link then comes in between social history having to draw upon the history of religious change. For example, education. You have educational institutions that are set up by different religions, the pathshalas, the madrasas, the convents. They educate and they socialize a child to understand the society in which it is living. And it is socialized according to the determination of the religious states, which explain to it how it should behave. Now, this is a very strong interaction between society and religion. Food, for example, the food one is allowed to eat is often controlled by religion. And so, too, interestingly, are the books that one is forbidden from reading. The moment a book is banned or removed from a syllabus, because as happens often these days, it is said to hurt religious sentiments, this act creates an area of dissent uh, quite quite quickly, and that aspect of dissent enters the life of society. And the codes of civil laws can then be, in some cases, controlled by religion, and they're determined by religious requirements. Religion cannot be disconnected from society. And this is one of the big points that I was trying to make by taking the idiom of religion as the area of dissent. And unless one opts out of society and goes off and lives in a wilderness, as the sannyasi was supposed to do theoretically, one is very closely involved, even as a religious person, with society. And one of the avenues of commenting on dissent, therefore, is through commenting on religion. And that's the kind of point I was trying to make. One forgets what a powerful force religion is in exercising control over people. One always thinks of the softer side of religion. And when one objects to the control, it becomes a form of dissent. It is a moot point as to whether it is the impact of conformity or the impact of dissent that moves a society in a particular direction. And we have to be aware of the difference between the two. You have asked, how do we look back at the past from the vantage of the 21st century? And we must remember that the present not only evolves from the past, but it also often looks to the past for legitimizing its actions in the present. When one asks, for example, what is the logic of performing a particular ritual, one is generally told, one's given an explanation, and then one is told that it's come unchanged through the centuries. And this is a very strong point of legitimation. And we accept it as an argument. Historians now tell us, and there have been many studies on this, that tradition, which determines many actions, is actually invented. And inventions, as we know, are continually changing in order to keep up with historical change. So it's a rather fluid situation that one is thinking of, and that fluidity has to be present when one is making these arguments. And what this tells us is that we have to look at the past through a critical inquiry if we're not just fantasizing about what happened. As historians, we now have to observe a method by which we ascertain the past and what actually comes from the past and what is otherwise a recent invention. The past is not something that is just lying out there waiting to be picked up and cleaned up and polished and used in the present. In the history that we write, we are actually continuously reconstructing the past and using new ways of testing what we might perhaps already know. But sometimes the new ways reveal new bits of information and knowledge. And it is an effort to try and understand what happened in the past and use current methods of analysis that are more dependable than the ones that we have used so far. And this is why historical readings can sometimes change. I'm often asked, but history is based on facts and the facts don't change. Yes, we all read facts, interpret facts, and the interpretations might change. So let me also go on to say that there are two attitudes to the past. The popular one picks up any story that is attractive about the past and believes that it may well have happened. So legends and myths that are admittedly great fun to narrate are picked up and having actually happened. It is a way of playing around with the past that people can certainly do if they wish to. I have no objections to that, provided that they don't then project their playing around as history. They understand that that playing around is fantasy and myth. And there is a difference between the two. Then there is the historical attitude to the past, different from the popular attitude. The historian uses a method to investigate the past. And the first step in this method is that the explanation of the past has to be based on sources which are reliably checked. You cannot take something that's said in a book and say, well, it's said in the book, so it must be true. You have to check that source. And the second step is that when you make a causal connection and you say A was linked to B, B A gave rise to B, or whatever you're saying, which history is full of. Trying to explain what happened. One is constantly talking about the causes of what happened. That discussion has to have a logical connection. The bases have to be logical, and it has to be based on rational thinking. It doesn't allow for myths to be taken literally as history. And this is a very, very important distinction, which many of us historians of liberation in India have spent a long time talking about it, explaining it. And this is part of the problem today, which has resulted in this big battle over history. Books and essays are removed from a syllabus. Textbooks are being rewritten in order to legitimize a particular ideology. Now, the battle is not, as it is being presented, as being between leftist historians and rightist historians. It is a battle between history and non-history. And that's the point that I would like to very much emphasize. Those that dissent from the ideology of those in authority are quickly described as anti-national. This is, of course, all too familiar to us today. But this has also happened more than once in other parts of the world. I don't have to remind you of the kinds of things that happened in the last century. The more dramatic occasions were, of course, the history of the Aryans in Germany, as written by Nazi ideologues, and the history of the Chinese after the Cultural Revolution in China. The end result of these kinds of so-called histories is not history, but a fantasy on the ideology claiming to be. Much damage was done by this to the perspectives of the people that were affected. And the debris of this damage, I'm afraid, is still around. So one has to be careful about how to use history and how to use dissent.
Thank you so much for that. That's really such a stirring. It's such a. I mean, in the times that we live in, I guess these degraded times, it's to hear that kind of stirring and robust defense against the anti-intellectual tirades, tsunamis that we are facing. I really think that's extremely valuable, and I'm so glad that Leonard is recording this because I know that students all over should be paying attention to that. A really superb answer. Thank you so much for it, Professor Thapar. I really appreciate it. Once again, I feel like uh, we're really privileged in our little book discussions to have that kind of discourse.
I'm privileged to have you all as an audience.
Oh, I really mean it. I really mean it. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to write out that answer. I really appreciate it. Professor Thapar, I have asked you 3 or 4 other questions, but I'd like to, if you don't mind, since there's a comment by Anita Guha, who I guess is in Bangalore, I'd like to skip question 3 for the moment and move forward to question 4. Is that okay?
Yes, fine.
So in question 4, I ask, which pertains to what Anita has said, in his Argumentative Indian, I actually pulled out my copy of the Argumentative Indian and looked at it because there are points of resonance and also synchronicity, but also points where you diverge quite dramatically. Of course, Professor Sen is not a historian, as such, not a professional historian, I should say. He certainly writes history when he. But in his Argumentative Indian, Professor Amartya Sen argues that heterodoxy has always been accepted and prevalent in Indian thoughts and beliefs. He actually claims that it is central to Indian thoughts, beliefs, ideas. My question to you is: would you agree with this? You've made the case that dissent has always been present, and it has made in that wonderful answer example you gave us of Buddhism about how dissent, even though Buddhism in a way kind of lost in the long term, it made profound changes in the way Indians thought about themselves and constructed society. So my question to you, but Amartya Sen says it's central. So my question to you is: would you agree? And if so, this is a crucial point. Why was it so important for colonial Indologists? And of course, so much of our current intellectual tradition has uncritically accepted what has come from the colonial Indologists. Why was it so important for the colonial Indologists to gloss over this very rich history that we have of dissent or heterodoxy? Why was it so important? So first, would you agree with Professor Sen? And secondly, why was it important for the Indologists to kind of downplay it?
Yeah, I would say in answer to that question that heterodoxy was obviously present in the Indian past, or else we would not have had such a sophisticated civilization. You cannot have sophisticated thinking unless you have people who are questioning that thinking and you are in dialogue with people who may be opposed to what you're saying. Philosophical schools of pre-modern times were fully aware of the centrality of heterodoxy, of the opposite opinion in all intellectual discussion. Hence the statement, and I think this is very important, and I'm always quoting this, the statement in Indian philosophical circles that discussion begins by first considering the view of the opponent, then going on to considering your own view and setting up a dialogue between the two, or setting up a monologue in which you destroy the opponent's point of view. And from this discussion, there may emerge a possible solution. This is what is frequently popularly referred to in philosophical circles as the Purva Paksha, the Pratipaksha, and the Siddhanta. The hint of a dialectical method, and sometimes it's more than a hint, is recognized in much of philosophical thinking. So heterodoxy is very much present uh, uh, in the history of Indian thought. As to the question, the second part of your question, we must remember that there were two kinds of colonial studies of India. Some resulted from an intellectual curiosity about an unknown culture and came up with a variety of ideas to explain this unknown culture. However, the major colonial scholarship on India was geared to the governance of the colony and therefore found explanations that made it easier for the colonizer to assert authority. They argued, and this was a very famous argument that carries on to this day, and I've had to write a great big vast tome of 1,200 pages to try and counter the argument. They argued that Indians lacked a sense of history and therefore did not write the kinds of histories that are associated with ancient Greece and ancient China. But this assertion was also made because they wanted to insist on their own two-nation theory being the foundation of Indian history. You cannot allow heterodoxy to come in if you're talking about there always having been two nations constantly in conflict. Colonial administrators in various capacities did a most impressive job in unearthing sources and housing archaeological finds in a manner that they could be used to construct the history of the colony. And I'm talking about the early history. Nevertheless, the actual interpretation of the past conformed to the colonial ideology about India. Exploiting history to support a political ideology has often been used in times. And the prime example currently of this kind of link is, of course, the two-nation theory, which derives directly from colonial understandings. It was constructed by colonial historians and is being loyally continued in the ideologies of religious nationalism, both Islamic and Hindu, the two nations being the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, according to colonial writers. Having invented the two-nation theory, the history of religion then became a central study to historians in particular. It was then necessary that religion be fitted into the mold of the Abrahamic religions, which were the religions that the colonial scholarship was familiar with, so that the theory would be held. And also, it made sense to those who were governing. It was easier to follow a religion if you put it into the mold of a religious system that you're familiar with. So each religion was described as a unified monolithic religion permanently in conflict with the other. And this construction ignored what I think is crucial to any religion in India. It ignored the centrality of the sects in the Indian religions. The many sects reflected the conformities as well as the dissensions and the nuances. And the construction of the religion was based on the texts of the elites, even if the religion of the majority did not exactly match that of the elite, which is a very common observance about Indian religions. In every Indian religion, there is a distinction in what the elite is arguing for and performing and worshipping, and the rituals that go through, and those of the non-elites.
As yeah, I mean that's wonderful. Thank you. That is a section. I think that entire section, the entire second half of this essay, all of it. The first half, of course, leads to the second half. The second half is filled with these, I would say, quite. It's quite a dramatic progression, which leads us exactly to where we are today, and that's what I appreciate greatly about it. And I highly recommend everyone reads it with the focus on that. Thank you for your answer, Professor Thapar. You Which brings us to question three, in a way, which I had sent you earlier, which I think, in a way, it flows very nicely from this, which is I was intrigued by your mentions of heresy. The areas of history I'm most interested in tend to be 20th century, actually, 19th and 20th century. And one of my favorite books, actually, is by Peter Gay, and it's called The Lure of Heresy. So I was intrigued by your use of heresy here, because I do think a heresy is kind of, I mean, Gandhi was a heretic, right? In a way. I mean, we don't have, Hinduism doesn't have that, exactly that form of someone going against the book, but in his actions against caste, forcing his wife to do it, he was heretical, quite heretical. So heresy is clearly embedded in this story, in Dissent. And so I was intrigued by your mentions of heresy and its nature as a building block for counterculture. What is actually counterculture, which leads to progress? In the at the turn of the century, in the 20s, Gandhi was indulging in what would have been a countercultural experiment, for sure. So my question to you is: in this way, is dissent actually the foundational building block of the democratic experiment? And what do we lose? What have we lost in the past? But what do we lose when dissent is legislated against, or even criminalized as it is today, with such devastating effect in many countries of the world, but in a very, very ghastly way at the moment in India today?
Yeah, well, heresy plays a role in creating dissent that may lead to a counterculture. It doesn't always lead to a counterculture, but it may well lead. It often does. Um, and this does not automatically mean progress. It
Hmm.
means difference. It means an alternative system. And it depends a lot on what is being critiqued, what is being put forth as an alternative to the existing culture. And of course, counterculture does not come as a fully formed structure. Usually, it is elements that are picked up and used in various ways to suit the argument or the conditions that are being discussed. Heresy is also not present in every situation. Heresy is more evident in a fairly tightly controlled application of belief or behavior, and that is not always central to every religion. To most, yes, but perhaps not to all. This is a debatable question. I think if the history of heresy in India was to be investigated, it would probably be found to be more prevalent in modern times. But I wouldn't take a bet on this. This is suggested by the reformulation of Indian religions as unified monolithic religions in colonial times. Otherwise, in earlier times, what is thought to come close to heresy, I think, is when caste rules are disobeyed. I see much more commonality between religious heresy in the Abrahamic religions and the way in which caste is treated in India. Among the upper castes, this is with reference to the occupations they take up. I mean, they break the rules quite often. This is one of the exciting things about studying history. You keep coming across examples where the rules are broken. But theoretically, those rules have to be observed. And among the lower castes, it's when they break the taboos of proximity to the upper castes that they are most bitterly attacked. It might be worth investigating, therefore, whether in India the notion of heresy was applicable more frequently to breaking caste rules rather than to opposing religious beliefs. The Hindu, for instance, had the choice of worshipping whichever deity he chose to, and that was fundamental to, for example, the immensely popular bhakti movement, where you chose your teacher and you chose the deity you were wishing to worship and continue to do so. We have references, for example, where in the same dynasty, some kings patronized Shaiva deities or Vaishnava deities and sects, and some patronized a Jain sect. And I would say, yes, that dissent is central to the existence of democracy. Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind about that. A citizen has to have the right to disagree and express this disagreement, but in non-violent manners. Dissent does not legitimize violence against one's fellow humans. I think this is an important point to keep in mind when one's talking about dissent. This is dissent prior to its becoming protest, revolution, revolt, or whatever it may be. It's the initial dissent. Today, the essence of democracy is that decisions are taken after a proposal is widely discussed and debated. This can result in a further strengthening of what is being proposed, or its modification, or even its rejection. Decisions in a democracy have to reflect this discussion and the emergence from the discussion of what is being projected as a possible law. If dissent is disallowed or criminalized, then this would indicate an attempt at closing democratic governance, and the political form may cease to be a democracy.
I have a number of follow-up questions to that, but maybe we'll come to that in a little bit. I guess related to this is question number 5, which is, could you please explain? I found this entire section of your book really interesting because I hadn't seen it put as succinctly and as clearly as you did, as you have, which is, can you please explain how the reconstruction, or you could call it the revivalism of the Samaj movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, left out significant aspects of the faith practices that had prevailed in the subcontinent, perhaps prevailed in those very communities or families in previous generations, and also added elements which did not previously exist, which has kind of come to mean tradition today. But this was, as you said, invented in the 19th and 20th centuries. Could you explain a little bit more about this? How did it work? And what maybe what a bit of what was the reasoning and thinking at the time that this was the religion or the our idea of religion and faith practices were reconstructed in the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yes, let me preface what I'm saying by the fact that, this is an area of specialization that I have not spent too much time on, but I have read briefly on it and thought about it a little bit. The prominent movements that label themselves as Samaj are the Brahmo Samaj, the Pratha Samaj, the Arya Samaj, as we all know. These were essentially middle movements and therefore inclined to have a largely middle class following. They were reacting to the colonial criticism of Indian religion and were trying to introduce reforms that would bring Hinduism into a closer conformity with the colonial idea of religion. The attempt was not to say, well, I will analyze what was meant by religion in India in pre colonial times, but rather we have a format which has been given to us, and therefore we have to see to what extent our religions conform to that format. This, in a sense, determined what they highlighted and what they introduced into their version of the religion. This was the new material that was inducted. Their definitions of religion came from the textual theological aspects of belief and practice of those that stated that they were Hindus. But they were mainly upper caste, then emerged as the middle class. Upper caste Hindus focused on the Hinduism that they practiced and were relatively unconcerned with the religions of those who were outside the Varna caste. And Varna became a very important issue here. Uh, those outside Varna, of course, are referred to as the Avarna, those without caste. And the latter was not known to them in any great detail and didn't seem to matter very much in the new construction that they were making for themselves of the religion. However, this is in some way a rather primitive, simple categorization, but I think it's a categorization that um, is quite interesting in the way in which it has been developed by some historians of the period of modern history. However, there were some exceptions to this with dissenting views. For instance, the Samaj that was founded by Jyotiba Phule and his supporters, which addressed not the welfare of the middle class, but the religion of the Avarnas. It was a different issue altogether. And they, interestingly, also used colonial historians' interpretations. They used the other major colonial construction of Indian history, early Indian history, and argued that there was an Aryan invasion which established the power of the Brahmins and therefore the oppression of the Avarnas. Further south in India, there were the other dissenting groups that constituted the anti-Brahmin movements. So what I'm trying to suggest is that one has to understand these changes taking place as responses to this interpretation of India that colonial scholarship is giving them at that time. And it's important to keep that in mind. It's not out of the blue that they're doing this. They are reacting to something. And what was left out and what was inducted had much to do with why these new types of movements emerged. Because they are new in many ways. You never had Dalits, for example, getting together and talking about their own Samaj in this form. One could ask, did the upper castes fear a radical change in their concept of Hinduism? And therefore, were they interested in making some concessions in reformulating the religion? I don't know. It's a question I think that one can consider and think about.
That's very interesting. It actually leads us to the next question, but let me quickly follow up that. Do you think also it was the fear of potentially the fear of conversion, of that conversion might occur or might be seductive. Do you think that's one of the reasons that this took place?
Well, it was the fear of, well, what did conversion mean? I mean, the interesting thing is the crisis of conversion where Hinduism doesn't have conversion.
Right.
So what do you do with it? I mean, this is why even the
Well,
present day
and
movement of,
prominent members of these middle class communities and upper class communities, the same people who founded the various samajas in the 19th and 20th century, prominent members from these communities were becoming, for instance, Christians,
yes,
had become Christians, and and I think that certainly the way I would, and again, I have not studied this in any depth. One of it seems to me that the timing is too coincidental not to be partly a reaction. I think there's some writings about it. In the case of the Arya Samaj, the Christianity is referenced in the making of it.
oh, yeah.
But so anyway, that was just a question. Is there something you'd like to say about that?
No, I was just going to say that in fact, Christianity is very prominent in all of this. I mean, there is the fear of certainly of the um, perhaps so to some degree conversion, but to a greater degree also the fear that this was a religion that would replace
Right.
the existing religions, and that fear certainly was there, and therefore a tendency to try and accommodate as much as possible as was the flexibility that Hinduism had.
It's interesting. The reconstruction of religion 100 years later in the 21st century does bear some of the similarities, I would say, in a way, perhaps. So it leads us perfectly to question number six, and there are so many other things I'd like to ask you, but I don't want to take too much of your time either. But I was intrigued, and we are coming to you from Goa, where there's a significant minority and a very old tradition of Christianity in the west coast of India, 2,000 years old, or perhaps dating back the Thomasite Christians. So it's a very old tradition that exists here, and certainly in Goa it's been entrenched. It was definitely here in the pre-port colonial era, but it's definitely become entrenched in the last 500 years or so. But you said most of your arguments, most of your statements in this absolutely lovely book are very carefully qualified, hedged, and constructed with a weight of a considerable amount of evidence. But there was one statement which is a little bit of a throwaway in a way, and I was intrigued by it. And since you're speaking to someone from Goa, I thought I should ask you. And it on page 86, you say, and it's not there isn't much else about it, but you say that the relationship patterns of Abrahamic religions to their societies sits uncomfortably in the Indian context. So my question to you is, could you please elaborate on this idea and also its implications?
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you.
Um, as you know, I'm not a specialist in the history of religion, and I've really come to study some aspects of it because I'm interested in socioeconomic, cultural history, and so on, which is in part associated with different aspects of prevailing religions. So I'm interested in the interface of religions with each other and with social institutions. And in thinking about the forms of religion in the world, there's a kind of assumption, or has been until very, very recently, that dominates the definition of religion, and that is that the Abrahamic form, as in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was the normal form. And so there has been a tendency over the last 200 years to fit everything into that kind of format. And perhaps even to impose this framework on religions in general, and more so on religions that were very powerful. It's easier to see them in this way. And in a sense, apart from shamanism, which is treated almost as a non-religion, there is a tendency to look for a particular pattern all the time when you come across a new religion. A founder, a single deity, an organization, a text, a creed, a catechism, and so on. Familiarity with an existing pattern. But I think that if one moves beyond the concerns of theology and examines how religions have made connections with society, which is, of course, the required connection that keeps religion going as a public force, it has to have that social connection, then perhaps we have to consider a different scenario for the non Abrahamic religions. And here I'm really thinking China and India in the main. Confucianism and Buddhism in China, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity as well, the Indian version, as it were. And let me just speak about a couple of aspects of religion in India that I think are different and really need to be taken much more seriously than they have been. We tend to think of religion as a unified monolith. Does this really hold in all societies? Are all religions monolithic? In India, every religion seems to give rise to multiple sects. I've not counted them, but I think it would be worth doing a count as to in how many areas do religions break up, not break up, but give rise to sects, give rise to sects. And these sects range in each case from the ultra orthodox to those that are openly heterodox. There's a whole range. Yet they all seem to locate themselves somewhere or other in this vast universe of sects. They find a place, they find a location, they find an association. And the sects are therefore juxtaposed, and they're either so positioned as to have some overlapping elements with the next one, or else they are dissenters and distinctively different. Both kinds. And religious identities, until recently, were more often sectarian identities. If you ask somebody in the pre modern age what their religion was, they wouldn't say Islam or Hinduism, they would talk about the particular sect that they were members of. And sects being in dialogue often led to the emergence of new sects. The dialogue was at that level, not at the monolithic level of two religions in conversation. And this, in a sense, explains the imprint of a plurality of religious belief and practice. I think that is extremely important. That when you're choosing your deity and you're choosing the sect that you wish to belong to, there are these subtle differences that cannot be overlooked. And we tend to just keep on papering them over. The context was one where there was much scope for the borrowing of beliefs and practices. And this, it seems to me, does make religion in India very different. I mean, the Arab traders come in to the western coast and they settle down as migrants in these communities. They don't convert, but they create new communities. They intermarry locally and they create the Khojas and the Bohras and the Mapilas and the Nawayats and so on. Now, this ability to create new forms out of the interface of existing forms is, I think, extremely important. And the other major difference with other parts of the world was the close tie between religion and caste. And I think that this is really very important. The rules sometimes overlapped. And what is curious is that caste continued into the religions that were largely of converts, such as Islam and Christianity, and in which, in theory, treated all humans as equal. But in practice, the old caste differences carried on. The fundamental distinction, for example, between the Varnas and the Avarnas, what today would be called upper castes and Dalits, was observed to a greater or a lesser degree in Indian Islam and in Indian Christianity. And so too was a broad hierarchy of occupation and caste when it came to defining status. And conversion may have changed belief and worship, but it does not seem to have allowed the total discarding of caste. And this is an issue and an area which I think needs much more exploration and explanation than it has been given. And these are, in fact, only the two obvious, understandable examples, but a further search would doubtless reveal more. And in terms of the interface of religion and society, which I'm continually stressing, it is these areas that need to be investigated.
Right. Very interesting hearing you say those things. I would argue, of course, I mean, it is only a tiny little nuance, and in no way it doesn't challenge your argument at all. But that Christianity itself fractured into many different facets, and is fractured into many different facets in India. Certainly, Konkani Catholicism is very often unrecognizable to people who come from another part of the world. I mean, there are recognizable aspects to it, but but there's a great distinctiveness to it. Professor Thapar, we have actually taken an hour of your time, but if you would indulge a couple more questions, would that be okay?
Yes, that would be okay. If I can
Thank
answer.
you so much. Thank you so much. So let me take a couple of questions from the audience, and then at the end, I would like you, before we end, so I don't want to miss out on that, I'd like to ask you about Shaheen Bagh, if you don't mind. So I'm going to take a question from Dilip R, who is an assistant professor at Brennan College. I guess that's in Kerala. He says you are comparing Indian philosophical argument with dialectical method in the prologue of your book. Can we look at the form of argument as a game? Acharya and Brahmachari are roles taken in the game of dialogue of questions and answers. That may be slightly garbled. They seem to be victors and losers in such practices. Is that a question you'd like to take?
Well, I think it's a complicated question because dissent and orthodoxy by themselves cannot be victors and losers. You have to assume that there is a historical background in which this confrontation is taking place. And who wins and who loses is not a matter only of religious belief, it is also a matter of who has the more powerful patrons, who has a better financial outlay, who has charisma and a following among people. So it's a question that cannot be answered very quickly without taking specific examples and looking at those examples and trying to work them out, it seems to me.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Dilip. We have a quick question. We have a question also from Anita Guha again, who's been paying attention throughout. Thank you, Anita. She asks if there was a fear of one's religion disappearing, wouldn't it be more natural to try and corral it in some way to keep the other out? Instead, it seems, I guess, there was an attempt to co-opt other religions into Hinduism. Is this a fact?
Uh, well, I really don't know enough about the 19th century situation where the really big danger was there. Yes, there might have been a danger earlier on, but in fact, the same situation prevailed. I mean, there are some people who refuse to admit it, but Hindus were regularly in the employ of the sultans and the Mughals and so on. And there were differences, but there were also lots of commonalities between them. I think that the thing that has to be kept in mind is that right through history, this is true of many religions, but since we are talking about India, I will stay with the majority religion here. Right through history, there has been this tendency for religious groups to bring in ideas that they think are useful to them. If there are large numbers of people interested in the ideas of the other religion or the practices of the other religion, so why don't we quietly bring those practices into our religion? Which is a perfectly good, logical way of arguing that we need followers, we need people who will support our religion. And if these are the things that they would like, and they don't very strongly disagree with what we hold, we can find ways of accommodating them. And I think that this accommodation is something which is an extremely important idea in all religions. But there are some that will take to very extreme measures to prevent it. And then you have to ask the question, who is doing the preventing? The people who are believing, or the people who are actually using that religion for other purposes, like holding on to power or, whatever it may be, creating a force for themselves. So that I think that these are questions that cannot be answered in the abstract. You have to think about specific issues and relate them there and see. And if you have enough investigations of specific issues, then you can generalize about them.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. I wanted to ask you about Shaheen Bagh. This occurs. It actually, in a way, it ties into. So I mentioned that on my way actually to set this up at my home, I went and picked up coffee, and I met your old colleague Majid Siddiqui, Professor Majid, and we were talking quite a lot about. We were speaking about your book, and we were talking about, in a way, the fascist moment that Europe lived through in the 30s, and what did it take to defeat that? I mean, there were various kinds of dissent, and there were political movements against it, but in the end, it took war to actually end fascism in Europe, and in other places it kind of morphed, and or certainly various kinds of authoritarianism got morphed and got sucked into capitalism. Um, I was very touched. I think really, again, I'm going to use the words emotional core of your book is when you went to Shaheen Bagh, and you speak of the continuities of dissent, that has a deep echo and a contemporary version of the kind of dissent that we have very frequently experienced in times not so long ago. And you went to Shaheen Bagh, and you talk about two things. And if I'll just read these paragraphs quickly for the readers, which you say that this movement and the many others like it that it generated took form at a point in historical time that marks a change in upper middle class Indian society, organized and participated in by women. I think that's a very important point. That women should speak up on an issue tied to birth and citizenship makes perfectly good sense. It's almost predictable. Then you say equally significant was the fact that it was a movement that did not use the idiom of religion. Theirs was a secular articulation of a kind that one associates with the rights that should come with citizenship. I felt after many years that I was witnessing a form of dissent that was somehow taking off from the roots of anti colonial nationalism. There was no mistaking its all inclusive character. It took me back to the 1940s and to my very youthful participation in anti colonial nationalism. I was so touched and impressed to read that because it's very heartening to hear that from you. Because, in your marvelous career, you've actually seen the entire trajectory of contemporary India from 1947 and the freedom movement at that time to this moment. Could you explain a little bit more? Let's make this the last question because we've been kept you for more than an hour, and I really don't want you to or us to overstay our welcome in your home, as it were. Um, so, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about Shaheen Bagh, which really brings us to where we are today and the questions that are on all of our minds. I mean, if we had not had this pandemic, possibly inevitably those protests would have continued. I think you're seeing something like that with the Kisans, with the farmers storming Delhi, and I hear that they're taking clothes with them and they plan on staying through the winter. We shall have to see. But can you explain a little bit about Shaheen Bagh and elaborate a little bit on your comments and give us a sense of where you think we're going to go or where we are going based on your reading of history?
Yes, well, let me begin by saying that I'm a firm believer that historians should never be asked to predict the future.
Sure, sure.
No idea where we're going. I have no idea how we're going to go where we might not want to go. But,
Okay.
all right, I have some ideas, but they're not based on any kind of historical analysis, which says because this is happening today, that will happen tomorrow, which is
Sure, sure.
expected.
Let's take that as granted.
Yeah, all right. Now, I think that the other point that I was trying to make in the book, and perhaps not forcefully enough, is one of my interests in the 20th century was the basic question that kept coming back to me whenever I read anything on Gandhi's movements. Nothing too extensive, but the little bit that I did read. The question that whatever Gandhi put together as his understanding of non-cooperation and so on, his method of expressing his dissent and his protest. What struck me as very important was the question of why was there such an immense response to his call for standing up against colonialism. I think that's terribly important because this was not an organized revolution by groups. It was not an army, a militia coming in and saying, you have to do this. This was a natural kind of exuberance. And that was part of the reason why I wrote the book, looking at dissent and looking at the importance of one aspect of dissent, which is, of course, renunciation. Renunciation not in the true brahmacharya sense of you renounce society and you go off into the wilderness and you live in total isolation, but renunciation much more in the shamanic sense of you renounce society, but you join an alternative society, which is propagating an alternative social ethic. And that alternative social ethic, I think, is extremely important and significant, which perhaps we haven't appreciated sufficiently. And that was one of the things I was trying to underline in saying that there's a continuity of renunciation, not for religious reasons, but for the reasons of saying we are a society that is interested in and is trying to bring about a different social ethic. Now, if I'm right, then the whole movement of nationalism that took on this attitude becomes a terribly important movement historically as a point of immense change, of historical change. And I relate that to the fact that, what happens with colonialism going away is the coming of a nation state, and the idea of citizenship. And this idea of citizenship is totally, entirely different from all the ideas that we had before about people and governance and authority. Why is it different? Because, first of all, the state is created by an act of a number of people getting together and formulating what the state should be. This has never happened in the history of this country before. The citizenship is, previously it was always subjects. People were subjects of the Raja, they were subjects of the British Raj and so on. Now they're citizens, they're not subjects. They're citizens that have rights. And these rights are in relationship to the rights they have to the state, and the state has rights and obligations to them. The citizen has rights and obligations to the state. And this is what the Constitution is all about, you see. And I think it was extremely significant and symbolic that the people in Shaheen Bagh were constantly reciting the preamble of the Constitution. Because for me, that was an indication of a kind of recognition that perhaps they weren't even fully aware of the changed status of the Indian today. The Indian is no longer a subject of anybody. The Indian is a free citizen. And that, I think, was the thing that was most symbolic, which really made me feel that this is a new world. It's a new world. And it's a new world that comes from a moment of nationalism that challenged not only colonialism, but also in that challenge, through that challenge, challenged the earlier history as well. So it was a very, very strongly defining moment, which I think was really which touched me enormously, which made me feel that there's a continuity from that moment to now, because so many ideologies today that are dominant are colonial ideologies, which we still have to fight. We haven't struggled enough against them in order to be truly liberated as free citizens. But this is the important difference.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I don't know what to say. I agree with you in many. I, of course, was not able to go to Shaheen Bagh. I really felt after reading your essay that I should have. It's interesting. It is a reinvention. In a way, I love the centrality of the Constitution. In a way, it is a reinvention of history in the sense that we, the national story or the story that we've told ourselves of belonging in a way has always focused around Gandhi. The idea of Gandhi, and here it's kind of Ambedkar. And Ambedkar is central to the Shaheen Bagh
Right.
conception of our national identity, and I think that's a wonderful thing. And his readings are coming back, and I think that it is a hopeful moment. And I really want to thank you for that last statement and for the book. Viewers should know that Professor Thapar went to Shaheen Bagh, and then she came back, and then this awful pandemic situation has exploded on us. But she wrote this book. She researched and wrote this book, formulated it, and I must say also in this awful pandemic year, in which so many horrible things has happened, it's not ending too badly because this has been really an exceptional, unusual, and very special pleasure. Thank you so much, Professor Thapar, for being with us. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Leonard, for setting up this opportunity. Is there something else you'd like to say, Professor Thapar? Because otherwise we will end.
No.
Thank you to the audience.
Yes, thank you for the audience. No, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the book. It's been a good.
Post-pandemic, you must come to Goa, and we will have another session with a large audience of, including the university students, and I look forward to that very much. All the best for your birthday in a couple of days. All the
Thank you.
best wishes from Goa, from collectively from all of us, and thank you so much, Professor. I really appreciate it.
I would love to come back to Goa. I have very happy memories of being there. So
Great.
let's hope the pandemic ends soon, and I'll hold
Yes.
you to this. I'd hold you to.
Definitely, definitely. It's a promise.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Spend,
Bye bye.
spend
Bye
some
bye.
time in the bookshop.
Yes. Yes. Bye bye.
Bye bye.